The goal for each podcast episode is for us to be honest, open, and transparent. While conversations do include mental health, this show does not replace support from a licensed mental health professional. If you feel triggered by any of these conversations, please feel free to take a break from the episode and check in with your support system.
So I think that these are some really interesting notions of mental health, but I think going away from that and wanting the mainstream media and just, other media channels and just television shows, every single aspect of media to openly talk about mental health in a very positive way. And when I say positive, I mean just the truth of it, that showing that mental health is not just an impediment. For some people, it's helped them realize who they are. It's helped them gain empathy. It's helped them gain new connections. It's helped them gain new families. There's so many things that mental health does for people, and it's not just always a horrible thing that happens to people that, that unfortunately has been portrayed for a very long time, in my opinion.
What's going on, everyone? Thank you for tuning in to episode 38 of the Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health, the podcast. I'm your host, Abraham Scully, and you are tuned into the podcast for young adults and leaders in education wanting to learn how to create safe spaces for honest dialogue about mental health. This episode, we're talking about the power of storytelling. How can we use stories to create positive change? And we have a very special guest that I'm so excited to introduce to you. So without further ado, let's dive in. You're in for a good one today. We're going to be diving into the conversation about mental health and storytelling, and what role does storytelling play in mental health awareness, mental health advocacy. So I couldn't think of a better guest to bring on the episode for this specific conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you all Zane Landin. What's going on, Zane?
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. I am doing well. How's your day going so far?
Yeah, it's going well. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Nice. So am I. So let's dive into it. Before we actually get into your story and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing as an advocate, I did want to make mention that Suicide Prevention Month is actually this month, September. It's nationally recognized as Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And Speaks to Inspire, we recently published a blog about the new 3-digit tool to connect individuals with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And so this is 24/7 support, whether it's chat support or phone support, with a crisis counselor for anyone who is in need of speaking with someone. So you can now call or text 988 if you need that support. And here's the thing that we found, and what we know to be true, is that suicide is the leading cause of death among youth ages 10 to 24. So my recommendation whenever I talk about resources or tools is that it's always best to have the resources and not need them than to need the resources and not have them. So whether you're listening to this conversation right now and you're thinking, well, maybe you might not need it, maybe you know someone who may need it. So I would highly recommend to save the number 988 in your phone, just in case you ever come into a position where you need to utilize this resource or share it with someone who is in need. So I did want to get that out of the way, because obviously we want to make sure those who are listening, they have the resources if they need them. But I do want to introduce Zane. And Zane has been, all over the country, so many different platforms, whether it is as a writer, as a speaker, as a podcast guest. He's doing so much work at the White House. If there's anything having to do with mental health advocacy and really being in the forefront when it comes to being a voice to youth, to young adults in many different capacities, Zane is doing the work. He's on the ground and he's actually in it. So Zane, if you can just take a brief moment and introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you? What are you up to these days? And kind of give us the backstory as to how you got to where you are today.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much, Abraham, for having me. And for people who don't know, Abraham and I work together. I had a great chance to work with Speaks to Inspire for couple months for an internship, and I loved every part of it, and I love the work that you and your team are doing. So I'm really grateful to be on this platform to share my story. So as you know, my name is Zane Landin. I am from California. I'm 24 years old. I just graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Communication and Public Relations, which is what I'm passionate about. So I'm looking forward to talking about how communication and storytelling definitely plays a role in advancing mental health efforts, awareness, and advocacy. I describe myself as an authentic storyteller, PR or communications imagineer, all about engineering and bridging stories and making sure that people have the platform to share their voice. Because I think people have a voice, but some people may not have the platform. So one of the things I started was PositiveVibes Magazine, which I think that's really what pushed me into more mental health advocacy than I never thought I would. I've always experienced mental health, symptoms and conditions from a very young age, probably to when I was around 6 years old, just feeling anger and depression more so than probably other children. I had a hard time socializing as well. So I weekly I would see a counselor when I was in elementary school to help learn how to deal and manage with my emotions, especially from a child's perspective. I think that was really helpful for my development. I think I was fortunate. I think other children who need that definitely need those resources available to them because they do exist, but some parents just don't know about them. Sometimes they're not widely known. Sometimes even the school system doesn't inform parents that these are opportunities that their students can leverage that can help them with their mental health. And I think that's partly because it's not talked about. Sometimes we don't do as much as we can to support children and just people with mental health because we're just not having the conversations. And so to go back to the magazine, fast forward to all that, after what I experienced, I didn't necessarily think I was a mental health advocate. I did some mental health work in, university, and I was always very passionate about mental health, but I never considered myself a mental health advocate. I never thought that's what I'd be doing all the time up until the point of, the year of 2020, which we all know is the infamous year of COVID. And that was kind of what changed the landscape of everything, not just America, but every country. Every country was experiencing shifts in every single almost facet of their life. Some people have never experienced anything like this. And I think that the pandemic really allowed people to reflect on their life. And also for some, they were experiencing mental health conditions or symptoms or just a decline in their mental health more rapidly than they probably ever have before. I'm not going to assume. I'm just saying for some, this was the case. And for some, and I think that everyone experiences a decline in their mental health. Everyone experiences rejection. Everyone experiences some sort of downfall in their life. But the scope of COVID and what it showed us and what people were seeing every single day with unrest, with seeing death all the time, even experiencing death and not being able to see your family, or the inability to have a funeral or anything like that was going on during COVID. It wasn't just death, but it was like a lot of these things that we have come to terms with death, we couldn't even partake in, because of COVID. And so there was people who have passed away and maybe they never would get to see them a long time, or they don't get to visit them in the hospital. So there are these different things, all these different components that were making up COVID, because it wasn't just, of course, it wasn't just the disease. It was, it was all the other things around it. And how do we keep people safe? And so sacrifices were made, but I think people's mental health were definitely on decline from that. And it was just such a huge change for so many people. And I think that's why you even see people who are having heart attacks and a lot of different illnesses, because I think that even though we're going through a mental health epidemic, I think COVID really had an impact on people's minds and their hearts and their bodies in ways we didn't think it would, And so I know a lot of people that have experienced, who have passed away from heart attacks in just the past couple of years. I think that's partly the reason. Anyways, but, at the time in university, I was taking a class called copy editing or copywriting. And it was all about just, how to become a better copywriter for, journalism, AP style. We learned all about the basics of it. And our final project was we had to create our own publication. And the professor kind of guided us on how we could do that. And he had certain publications that, would you put these in your publication? So we had to create the mission statement. Basically, we just had to start from scratch. But it was very basic, like a low level of what it could possibly be. So I started off wanting to do something with horror, urban legends, and all these different things, stuff that I thought was really interesting. I ended up not pursuing that route because it had to be completely fictional or nonfiction. And so I don't know if that was going to fly with the professor. So I decided to really think about what I wanted to see. And I thought about positive vibes, and because I've always loved the term. And I also think that the term is a little, I think it's been hijacked by like toxic positivists. If that makes any sense. I'll explain what I mean. But I started just with that title because I wanted the mainstream media to talk about mental health more in a organic, healthy, natural way, as opposed to only talking about mental health or covering stories of mental health when it had anything to do with violence. Because that was the one thing I noticed was every single time I would hear about mental health in the news, it was always for this negative reason. It was never, this student started a mental health nonprofit.
Yeah.
Or we would see mental health when someone died by suicide. So I never saw mental health depicted in a way that wasn't negative. And I think that's one of the issues is that when we see this one-dimensional storytelling and we see stories of mental health in such a negative light, that's all people think about.
Yeah, it affects the way you even view the conversation or the topic.
Yeah, and I think that that's why there's a lot of stereotypes that people hold about people with mental health, that they are violent, they can never experience happiness, and they're constantly victims. So I think that these are some really interesting notions of mental health, but I think, going away from that and wanting the mainstream media and just, other media channels and just television shows, every single aspect of media to openly talk about mental health in a very positive way. And when I say positive, I mean just the truth of it, that showing that mental health is not just an impediment. For some people, it's helped them realize who they are. It's helped them gain empathy. It's helped them gain new connections. It's helped them gain new families. There's so many things that mental health does for people, and it's not just always a horrible thing that happens to people that, that unfortunately has been portrayed for a very long time, in my opinion. So I didn't really know what to start because it was just a project. And so I had my friend review it, and I kind of had this idea, why don't we actually start something like this? I don't know what would stop us, because basically nowadays you can kind of start anything.
That's true. So I do want to get into positive vibes, but you mentioned something that I thought was very important to kind of dig into a little bit. And that was kind of like your upbringing and being able to have that mental health support that you needed. And I want you to kind of share with listeners at that time during your life when you were struggling with your mental health, you needed support, you needed some resources, whatever that looked like for you. Were you able to articulate what was going on for you? Did someone recognize something and have a conversation with you? How did that happen? And how were you able to then get to a place where you got the support that you needed?
I wasn't really able to articulate it because of the time, like I said, I was really young. Yeah. So as someone who was 5 or 6, I didn't even notice a problem though. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So like children were just kind of experiencing life and not really recognizing or being mindful to what's maybe around us or what we're experiencing. Luckily, my family did have some history of mental health with family members, distant family members. My family has a lot of mental health history. And so my parents already knew about mental health, the community, and also just that seeing a psychologist is not a bad thing. And so they were already advocates for their children in ways that some families aren't. And like I said before, some families don't know about these resources, which is why I think the school system needs to do a better job of educating and also just trying to bring more awareness for these resources, especially through storytelling, because that's where you're going to hear a lot about these different things. And so I wasn't necessarily able to articulate it. And so really the support was the people around me.
Gotcha. And so they kind of saw certain things and then assumed that maybe you would need some additional support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I think for many people, they either don't have someone in their support network that is able to identify the signs. And so when they see those things, they label it as, oh, they're just going through a phase, or this is just, something that they'll grow out of, or they're just misbehaving, whatever, label we put on it. versus recognizing, hey, this can be a sign to let us know that mental health support is needed here. What would you say to anyone listening that, may be serving and supporting youth, young adults, in terms of what are some things they can possibly look out for, maybe from your personal experience? Or I know that you have, shared so many stories through Positive Vibes Magazine and all the work that you're doing in storytelling, maybe from a story that you've covered. But what are some signs that people can look out for in youth and young adults to recognize if they need that mental health support?
Yeah, I just think being present and there for them is what's important. I think that making sure that they're aware that they can come to you for anything, so that you don't necessarily have to always be checking, that you create that support system already. If it's a teacher, if it's an educator, if it's people in your family, because sometimes life happens and you're not always checking on everything. But I think that's one thing I would say is always check on the people around you, especially your friends, your family, and see how everyone's doing. But that's one thing I will say is just starting the conversation, making sure that understanding and empathy is there, that they know they can come to you for anything. But I think some of the signs you can see is just how are they doing? Making sure that you are reaching out, and maybe they're not doing well in school. Maybe they're not eating with the people they used to. Maybe they're not finding things interesting anymore. Maybe they're incredibly happy for some reason, because that's also an interesting sign too. Again, we think of mental health as someone who is very depressed, but sometimes someone who's very elated, maybe experiencing some sort of mental health there, like a very high form of happiness or joy, and you're wondering why that's happening. And so there's many different things, but I think just, especially if you're an educator, seeing the students in your classroom or the people around you, and maybe something's not right. Maybe someone is, like I said, not doing well. They seem distracted. And sometimes the school system punishes that behavior, though, instead of reaching out. And so when someone seems distracted in their class, they're not doing well, it's so easy to blame people and say, you need to be a better student, rather than how can I be a better educator and accommodate you and find you the support that you need. So those are some things that I could think of off the top of my head. And I'm not a mental health educator, but those are things that I know that I try to look out for. And that's things I've learned through who I've interviewed, and also certificates I've gone through, that those are some of the basic signs that we can do to support others. And I think
that's so good. A couple of things that I heard that really, stands out to me is empathy. Mm-hmm. and being intentional with building the relationship. I think when you see yourself as a gatekeeper or as someone who is, in an individual support system, there is a level of compassion and empathy that you have for that person, whereas they won't get away or go too far, from you, especially if you see that they may be in danger or they may be struggling. And so I think we can all tap into empathy, and through empathy, it helps us to identify, okay, this person is not acting like they normally behave, or they're saying certain things that maybe I need to ask about, or, have deeper conversations. But just showing up and empathizing with people, I think is a key, tool that we all can use to help and support. So that's really good. I love that you're using storytelling, because storytelling really brings people together. Why is it that you've chosen the route of storytelling out of so many different ways that you could have taken your efforts to advocate and bring awareness and education? Why storytelling?
This is perfect. I'm going to go back to the magazine, because my entire life I've always been inspired by stories like us all. Some of my favorite stories have been like Harry Potter and Disney and all these different things that have kind of made up my childhood. And the idea that these stories impact our lives so much already shows me that storytelling is really key in changing things and, creating awareness. Like if you think about the stories the way you felt, that stories have that impact. That to me shows that storytelling is not just to make people feel good. It's not just about nostalgia, but it also can serve a social purpose and like moving things forward. And I didn't realize that until the magazine. So like I was saying before, we start off with just a small Instagram channel, and that's what I really knew was just social media. And so we started with that, learned how to build a website, and that's what we did. And so then we we had a person reach out and they wanted to be interviewed. So we interviewed them and shared their story, and it just felt great to actually put someone's voice out there. Someone I had no idea who they were, someone that just reached out from across the country and had this amazing story about things that were very actually relevant because they experienced death. They experienced many forms of death. Like so many of their family members passed away. And I think during COVID, that was something people needed to hear. For people who are, this may be their first time grieving from someone close, someone who can speak on that level of mental health decline that they experienced. You know what I mean? And so it was exciting to interview. That was our first interview. And after that, that's what we focused on, was just interviewing these people who have a powerful story to share, because every single person does. And that's what I learned through the magazine. And just doing the magazine, I just learned how people really resonated with stories and that this is what they want to see. And like, what better way can you do that? Especially since there's a whole thing I see with mental health, which is you're not alone. But that's just words. You know what I mean? Like when someone says you're not alone, that's just words I'm hearing. What does that mean? But like when you hear an actual person and you actually can connect to that person, you read a story about someone who has experienced very similar things to you, that's when you know you're not alone. Because when I do hear the words, you are not alone, again, to me, that just feels like it's words. And I don't know what I'm supposed to think about that because I feel alone. And that's not going to help me. That doesn't mean we can't share that message, because I absolutely love the "you are not alone" message. But I think once we can get people behind it and people start seeing people on TV and on the screens that have these real stories of mental health, I think that's where change happens, because that's when you really are drilled in your head that, you know, you really aren't alone. And someone like you is on TV sharing their story, and you're not so different, which means that whatever you've been told, if you've been told negative things about yourself, if you've been gaslit to think it's your fault, all these different things, now you're seeing that wasn't the case. And there are people out there that are like you. And to me, that might inspire people to get help, find people that are like them, volunteer for an organization, because of that story and how it made them feel and how it made them feel like they weren't alone. So I hope that all makes sense.
This podcast is powered by Speaks to Inspire, the mental health solution for young adults suffering in silence. Did you know that students who experience shame and hold negative perceptions about mental health conditions are less likely to reach out for help? By marrying the art of storytelling with mental health education, Speaks to Inspire is creating safe spaces through comprehensive, high-impact programs that help colleges, universities, and schools increase engagement and retention. Learn how you can bring a Speaks to Inspire speaker to your campus by visiting www.speakstoinspire.com/speakers.
It does. And that's powerful, because when an individual who feels isolated, like no one knows, no one understands, no one cares, when they see someone that they can connect with for whatever reason, maybe it is their race, maybe it is their religious affiliation, whatever that specific thing that allows this person to connect with this person. And then they hear that, oh, everything that I'm experiencing, this person is also experiencing or has experienced. Mm-hmm. And that amount of connection is what really bridges the gap and I think creates positive change. I love that you mentioned you are not alone, how it can just be words oftentimes, but to bring life to those words is to actually share stories. And I know that you advocate, you know, for many different things. I've seen, you know, things where you're talking about disability, right? And how we can, you know, bring awareness to that conversation. And when someone who can resonate with a story, an individual, a real person who has a similar experience, they now have hope. And I think ultimately hope is what impacts lives for the better and can ultimately prevent suicide. So you've chosen to share stories, not just your own personal story, but the stories of so many people. I'd love to hear if there were any specific stories in Positive Vibes Magazine that has really stuck out for you, and why has those stories stuck out? Maybe one or two stories that you can share with our listeners.
Oh, absolutely. I've never been asked this, but Okay. All right. In August of 2020, when we were first starting off the magazine, I had the very wonderful opportunity to interview someone named Amy White, who to this day is my favorite interview. Because for one, it was like one of the first ones I did. So like I said, that was like when we were kind of figuring things out. We were actually doing interviews, and it was incredibly exciting. So we had this, I don't remember how it even came about. I think her PR firm reached out to me about being interviewed, which was a huge milestone, because I never thought that PR firms would reach out. That's just so exciting, especially when we were just starting. And they mentioned that she was a medium. So what I will say about the magazine, so if people don't know, we don't just focus on mental health. That's the giant theme of the entire magazine. But that means very different things for certain people. And for some people, they use spirituality to facilitate their mental health, right? And so people who are mediums, people who are psychics, they're using their gifts for mental health to support their mental health and others. You don't have to believe in this stuff, but we just put it out there because every experience is different. And we want to tell all the stories, everyone, who's doing light work. And for some, this is what they do. And so she is a medium. And if people don't know what that is, that's someone who can channel the afterlife and connect and communicate with people who have moved on. And again, you don't have to believe this, but this is their story, because I've never experienced it, but I loved hearing her perspective. So I really didn't even know what that was, what a medium was, until I had that interview with her. I don't know. Have you ever been in a situation where you're with someone and you just connect, and you don't even really have to say anything. You just are like at very similar energies. It's a really weird feeling. I don't even know why that happens, but yeah, I think towards the beginning of the interview, there was already some sort of connection where like I knew the interview was going to go well. It's like, wow, I feel really comfortable here. I feel safe. This is a really cool interview, because I would always get nervous before. But during the interview, it was so seamless, the conversation. Like we just were talking about her journey and how she's helped many families find closure. And that was just a very interesting thing to hear. And I've never even heard about mediums till I met her. So I was so new to everything. And then she mentioned, she was very open about suicide, and her son experienced mental health conditions and was suicidal. And she was just sharing how, as a parent, I don't know how to deal with this at the time. This was, before, but she was just saying, as a parent, it's just a very hard thing to come to terms with, which it is. I'm not a parent, but I can't imagine a parent hearing that their child wants to die, and maybe they'll purposely take their life. As a parent, how do you not blame yourself? How do you not sit there and think, this is my fault, I should have done anything differently? But it probably wasn't your fault at all. And so, but for some, maybe there have been circumstances where they could have done better. Mm-hmm. But it really depends, of course, on everyone's story. But I can't, as a parent, I feel like a natural feeling. And so it's just a very hard thing. And I just felt so connected. And even after the interview, I was like shaking, like literally shaking. Like I held my head down at the end of the interview, and I was like shaking. I was like, after I was like, what just happened? Like that was probably like the most inspirational interview I've ever gone through. I don't know what it was, and it was very emotional. And so that was like one of my favorite stories. And she talks about mental health, and she's also an author, so she is very incredible. And we did an Instagram live just a year ago to catch up, and again, very interesting stuff, the work that she does, and it's really, really fascinating. I will say that. And then there was one I did, Colm Holland. We actually have not released his story. It's actually coming out this week, which is pretty cool. He is what you call a modern day alchemist. And so alchemy was, if you've heard, like, was it turning stone and turning coal into gold? It's like that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting. But he does modern day alchemy, which means is he's all about the psyche. So we talked a lot about psychology, and it's all about how do you turn stones or something ordinary into gold. And he talks about your mind, and you have to accept the negative to embrace the positive. You have to confront your shadows. You can't avoid them, because if you don't confront your shadows, you can't reach a level of gold, if that makes sense. So he was actually really interesting. Yeah. And I just resonate with everything he said, and he just had a great spirit about him. So those are the two stories that I've loved the most. And again, they're very different. They're not exactly what we think of traditional mental health, which I think it's the point of the magazine too, is that traditional mental health, what does that mean? Like, we need to be encouraging people to seek therapy or seek talking to a psychologist or get medication. But for some people, being grounded in nature is what works for them too. And, I think if we only look at mental health as something that's medicinal or something that medicine can only treat, we're looking at mental health as a very one-dimensional thing when the mind has so many capabilities. And so, it's all about the holistic mental health. Your body, your health, your environment, your spirituality, your religion, every single thing impacts your mental health. And medication is not the only thing that's going to address that. I think that's something I'm seeing. And I love seeing content out there about people openly taking their medication, talking about their therapist. Have you noticed that, like in the workplace, like my therapist told me this.
Yeah.
Like they're just so open about just mentioning their therapist, which I think is exciting because at the time there was such shame in seeing a therapist or a psychologist. So I love seeing that. But I don't like this idea that therapy is the only option and that therapy or seeing a psychologist is a linear journey. So I think a lot of people, what they're seeing is they're looking at it as medicine again. And so, like maybe if you have a heart condition, you take medication or you do what you need to do, there's a chance that it just might be a linear journey and that you might just not have a heart condition because you did certain things or you exercise or whatever it was, you know what I mean? For anything, like for me, I've had headaches my whole life, but I took medication and now I really don't have them anymore. But mental health, again, is very different. We can't look at it that way. And even regular medicine, just because, someone had a certain condition before doesn't mean it can't come back. And that's how I think that's how we should see it too, that, with mental health, just because someone went to therapy for years doesn't mean it's gone, because I don't think it ever goes away. You just learn to live with it. You learn how to manage it. But I think it's like an ongoing experience that someone always has. So I think it's very dangerous to look at, therapists and psychologists as miracle workers.
And as the only option. The only option that works for all people. And I think one thing that you said that I think ties in very well with this is that we understand what works for others when we hear their stories. Yeah. So I think oftentimes when we have this one size fits all approach to everyone's situation, their condition, then we're not actually creating the positive change. And we actually isolate that person, because for the individual who has tried individual counseling and it doesn't work for them, but they have found another means for supporting their mental health and it actually works for them. But then we're saying, well, that doesn't work because that's not the one size fits all. We're now isolating that person. But the only way we get to understand what works and the different ways that people support themselves is by listening to their stories and allowing them to have the platform to share their stories. I'd love for you. I have two more questions. And I'm looking at the time, so I want to be respectful of your time. So 2 questions about creating positive change when it comes to this conversation about mental health awareness, mental health education. How can we use storytelling to create positive change?
I just think when you hear a story or you hear a speech, you're really moved by how you felt. There's that quote that, they say, you don't remember what the person did. You just remember how you made them feel or how you felt by what they said. You know what I mean? Like there's that quote. I think that's really important. I think how we're going to create positive change is to massively tell the stories of people with mental health conditions that we don't get to see. And I really do think that. And again, we have to be very mindful about the stories we share and tell, because storytelling is not a formula that's immediately going to create positive change, especially the type of stories you tell. Because as we've seen, there have been stories about mental health that are painted in a distorted light in a way that is not productive and not healthy for the mental health community. So I think that you have to really consider what stories you're telling and how you're telling them. That's what I think is the most important thing. I really think storytelling will drive positive change, but we really need to be careful on what stories we tell and how we tell them, especially something as sensitive as mental health. We really need to make sure that it's their story, we're telling it their way, but we're also making sure that we're telling it in a way that's productive and positive and truthful. I hope that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And what I hear you saying is telling stories with intention, right? Not just, this is what happened but really having intention behind what's the purpose of sharing this story? What are we hoping to achieve? How can this help someone? But I think in doing all of that, also honoring and valuing that this is an individual's lived experience, right? So yes, there is intention as to what can come out of sharing this story, but this is also honoring this person's experience. And I think when we make mention and make sure that aspect is clear, then we don't run the risk of labeling this as, well, if this was this person, then this will also be you. Because I think that's another path that may not be beneficial, whereas someone hears a story and they automatically attach themselves to that story. Well, if that worked for them, then that must work for me. Or if that is their lived experience, then that means that that's my experience, versus that was their experience. And obviously we can feel things and learn things from other people's experience, but really, being intentional with the storytelling. So I love that you share that. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll also say that, I didn't mention this, but I thought of it as you were talking. I think that, being intentional about the storytelling is not just making sure that we're telling that story, but how it's told and who is telling the story. Because not everything's going to be a documentary where you just share someone's story of their lived experience of something that factually happened. You might be creating characters, in a comedy or something, or even a horror movie that you bring up mental health. And horror is a really weird genre that it has, definitely taken advantage of mental health. But anyways, I will say, if you're going to write a story about mental health and you want to bring in different aspects like race or gender, you bring in those people that have those experiences then. Don't bring in writers that don't have the experience at all. Because writers are very imaginative and they can do their best. But if you want to tell the real authentic story, you bring in the people that have the lived experience and the background in these issues to actually talk about them and to paint these natural stories. So it's not just how you tell it, but it's who you bring in to tell it. Because if you don't have underrepresented people telling the stories, it's not going to come across as authentic. And I think we're seeing that with certain stories about mental health. So I've seen shows where they write about mental health and it's clear that there wasn't anyone in the room that had that experience because it wasn't told the best way.
Yeah, it wasn't told by, the person, or, with that experience. That's such a good point. Thanks for sharing that. My final question for you is, what does mental health mean to you?
I mean, to me, I think a lot of people, they kind of wrongly assume mental health is mental health conditions. I know a lot of people think that I don't have mental health. Yeah, you do. We all have mental health. It's literally just your mind's health. Just like we all have physical health, right? If we all have physical health, then we all have mental health. We all have the capacity to think. We all have brains. So I think that because of that, we all have mental health. Every single person has mental health, but not everyone has a diagnosable mental health condition. And so to me, mental health is just taking care of your internal, of your consciousness, of your cognitive. And I even wrote an article recently about, it's hard though, but, being mindful and like speaking kindly to yourself, like actually taking the effort to try your best. I know it's hard, but speak kindly to yourself and love yourself. I know I hear that term all the time, love yourself, but we forget the journey to love yourself because it's a very hard journey for a lot of people because there's millions and millions of people in the world who don't love themselves, probably billions. A lot of people don't love themselves. And I think starting with your own mental health and taking the time to care for yourself and just give yourself a break because, progress isn't always happening. You don't always have to be the best person. Just try your best. That's my opinion. I always see be your best self. Well, try your best because you're not always going to be your best self, and that's totally fine. And I think that when people are encouraged to always be their best self, it can be kind of harmful because that's just not the reality. And for some people, that expectation is like, I always need to be my best self. I always need to be hustling. You really don't. You can take a day off, give yourself some time. If you experience rejection, the next day, you don't have to be applying for another job. Like give yourself the time to experience it and give yourself a grace period where you can, you can heal. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thanks for sharing that. And thank you for, showing up in this conversation, being honest, open, transparent, really sharing yourself with us, telling us about your experience, the work that you're doing. I know that as listeners, hear this, they're going to want to connect with you. What's the best way that people can find you online or connect with you to continue the conversation? Or maybe they would love to learn more about PositiveVibes Magazine and possibly being on the magazine themselves. How can they connect with you?
Absolutely. My personal Instagram and LinkedIn are perfect. If you're going to send me a message, I will respond to you for sure. on Instagram. It's just my name. The magazine, it's Positive Vibes Magazine, and a lot of our handles are Positive Vibes Mag. And you can always DM me or the magazine. But if you want to be featured, please let me know. We would love to feature you. But if you also want to be a writer, we're always looking for volunteer writers. So a lot of different opportunities. But please let me know if you're interested.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Zane. This was amazing. I think it's going to add a lot of value to our listeners. Before you go, I do want to share some resources for those who may need them. So as I mentioned early on this episode, for 24/7 chat and phone support with a crisis counselor, you now can reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. You can call them if you're comfortable with calling. You can text if you don't want to call, and you have that access. So be sure to save that in your phone, share it with someone who may need it. Also, we have national resources, blogs, podcast episodes, just like this one, different guides created, through Speaks to Inspire. So if you go to speaks2inspire.com/resources, you'll have access to that. And then finally, I want to talk about this Facebook group community we have that is just popping. A lot of conversations around how can we advocate for youth and young adults, and just having the conversation, because the more we normalize this conversation, the more we can support those who need the support. Because I think oftentimes people don't reach out because of the shame and the stigma that you were talking about, Zane. And if this conversation is as normal as talking about going to the gym, then I think that we can get those who need support the actual support that they need. So you can find that Facebook group by searching Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health, and request to join, and we'd love to have you in there. And with that being said, I want to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, then share it with a friend, and we'll see you next time. Take care.